I ghosted my fiancée after she suggested a temporary open relationship just before our wedding, then cheated when I refused. Our story goes way back to when we were kids. I'm seeking advice on what to do when I return home in 2 days. Megan and I have been friends since childhood. Our parents were lifelong friends. We grew up together and began dating during our teenage years, almost as if it was what our families expected. They seemed to have more plans for us than we did ourselves. When I was pursuing my master's degree, I had to move to another city while Megan stayed in our hometown, working on her nursing degree. After a year of long-distance dating, we agreed to remain friends and not let the pressure of our relationship dictate our lives. We remained best friends and saw other people. It felt strange because we both knew it was only temporary and that we would eventually end up together again. Once I graduated, I stayed in the city where I completed my master's and started working in my field, waiting for a transfer back to our hometown. When I finally got the transfer, I was ecstatic. At that time, Megan was in a long-term relationship with a nice guy, though I always sensed he was uncomfortable with our friendship. I understood his feelings and respectfully distanced myself, even though Megan and I still spoke a few times each year. My boss and mentor, Tom, was a great guy, and we became good friends. One day, he asked to talk. He told me about an upcoming open position in a foreign city for 2 years, which would be posted soon. He described the position in detail, and though the pay wasn't outstanding, all expenses, such as rent, travel, and accommodation, would be covered. The job would be based in Tokyo, and I'd occasionally have to travel to other cities in Asia. I thought it over, consulted my friends and family, and decided to go for it. Tom mentioned that the job would be challenging but a fantastic opportunity to prove myself and advance in my career. He also shared how a similar opportunity had helped him early in his own career. So, I took the plunge and accepted. The first year was tough, as I had to adapt to the culture and social customs, not only in Japan but in the other countries I visited for work. One thing that surprised me was how many women were interested in foreigners. I was able to enjoy the delights of the Orient, as they say. These women weren't from third-world countries, most were highly educated. I ended up forming several friends with benefits relationships but was always upfront, making it clear I wasn't interested in anything long-term or marriage, since my stay was only temporary. Eventually, I extended my time there by 2 more years. Tom would visit a few times each year, either for vacations or to oversee some projects, and we had some wild times together in different cities, like Angeles City in the Philippines. When my contract ended, I returned home and put a hefty down payment on a house just outside the city. After living in a city of 37 million people, I craved a bit of space. I was home for about a month when I visited my parents, and Megan happened to be there. She had broken up with her long-term boyfriend about a year before, and we started talking more seriously. Even though we had kept in touch over the years, we began dating again. I was hesitant to jump into a sexual relationship, despite how much I wanted to, because I had developed a habit of having multiple partners while in Asia. I was trying to manage those urges before getting serious with Megan. Although everyone, including Megan, knew I'd been dating around, I had only posted occasional photos with different women on social media. My mom had even called me a womanizer a couple of times, which, to be honest, stung a bit. This is where things started to unravel. After Megan and I slept together, she seemed shocked. She said I was different and that I'd never been like that before. In other words, I had become much more experienced, to put it nicely. She started asking questions, and while I didn't lie, I didn't give her the full truth either. I didn't share the exact number of partners because, even divided by 3, it would still be scary. I had no doubt I could remain faithful to her, but I unintentionally planted a seed of doubt in her mind that would cause serious problems down the road. Our families were thrilled we were together again. It had always been expected. We were doing well, and after discussing it with her parents, I proposed. She moved in, and things were going great. But there were some warning signs, like her frequently asking if I was happy with her. Fast forward to December 2019, We had set the wedding for June 2020, but we all know how that year turned out. Christmas was lovely, but just before New Year's came the first major blow. I was sitting at my computer, working, while Megan and her cousin Rachel were going through some wedding details. I've known Rachel since we were kids, and we've always been cool with each other. Megan asked if we could talk, and Rachel went into the living room to sit on the sofa. I sat down at the table with Megan, and she started by telling me not to interrupt or freak out. She had something important to discuss. She mentioned the differences she'd noticed in the bedroom and said she was worried that I wouldn't be satisfied with her and would eventually cheat on her. She didn't want our future children or relationship to suffer if I strayed. At that moment, I thought I was about to get dumped. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I had this infomercial voice in my head saying, "But wait, there's more." Megan asked if I'd be open to us having an open relationship so she could gain more experience and feel more secure. She said I shouldn't worry, as I was the only man she had ever truly loved, and that's why none of her previous relationships had led to marriage. I agreed with that sentiment since I felt the same way. At first, I thought she was joking, this couldn't be real, right? But as I realized she was serious, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. I didn't think it was possible for my heart to skip a beat and leap into my throat at the same time. I'm not typically an angry person, but I started yelling. Suddenly, it made sense why Rachel was nearby. I shouted, "Rachel, did you put her up to this?" Rachel responded that she was just there to support Megan. "Wow, thanks a lot, Rachel." Then Megan said that I was free to do as I wanted under the same rules. I told her no. At this point, I was furious. Even now, telling this story makes me rage. I told her I didn't want random hookups, I just wanted one person. She asked who I had in mind. I glanced at Rachel, but not directly in her eyes, and said, "Rachel." That definitely got a reaction out of both of them. Megan was not pleased, and Rachel looked a bit flustered and uncomfortable. Megan told me that wasn't an option since Rachel was family, and it was gross that I even suggested it. Now I was in some alternate reality, wondering how we even got here. We argued back and forth for a while, and I made it clear that if she went through with this, the relationship would be over. I was completely against it and told her I loved her and believed we could work through everything together, but not this. I stormed off, grabbed my pillow, and slept in the guest room. I could hear them talking downstairs for a while, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It would have been a hilarious joke if the conversation hadn't gone on for an hour. I couldn't sleep the whole night and was a total wreck at work the next day. Megan had just started her 2 weeks of night shifts, so at least we wouldn't be home together for a bit, giving us both some space to cool down and revisit the situation later. Each day, she'd leave dinner for me in the fridge with an "I love you" note, and she kept texting me often, but I kept my responses short. The following Thursday, while she was still working night shifts, I sat down at my PC to work on some files and noticed a notification on her email account. It was a reservation for a hotel near my office, a place I knew well because I often went there with coworkers. I thought she was supposed to be working, but maybe this was her way of apologizing and planning a night out for us. The next morning, I waited for her to reach out, but she only asked about my day and mentioned how happy she was to have just one night shift left. That's when it hit me, how could she have one night shift left if she had a hotel reservation? My stomach dropped, and I felt sick all day at work. I even started looking through some dating sites, especially the profiles without pictures, hoping to find something. Tom stopped by my office to invite me to lunch, but when he saw the state I was in, he asked what was going on. Tom's pretty hardcore, he's a guy who's fully embraced going his own way, but he's always been supportive of my relationship with Megan. When I told him about the situation, he suggested we grab lunch at the hotel where the reservation was, and I freaked out, shouting, "No, not that place." He had no idea why. We ended up going to lunch elsewhere, but I couldn't eat. My stomach was in knots, and I didn't even want a drink. Tom could tell I couldn't focus and told me I could take as much leave as I needed, paid or unpaid, to deal with this. I told him I couldn't go back to my house, I couldn't face Megan, and a part of me still didn't want to believe any of this was real. I rushed home, packed whatever I could fit into my car, and headed straight back to the office. That's when Tom suggested we stake out the hotel and wait for Megan to check in. I wasn't really keen on the idea at first. I'm no private investigator, more like Inspector Clouseau's, but I knew I had to find out the truth. So, we sat in the lounge bar, and I started knocking back drinks, still hoping none of this was happening. Around 6:30, Tom tapped my shoulder and pointed her out. There she was at the front desk, not in her work uniform. My mind raced with anger, sadness, and confusion. I wanted to scream, cry, and lash out all at once. We waited about 10 minutes after she took the elevator before Tom and I approached the front desk. I asked to be put through to her room, and when she answered, I started yelling. She sounded confused, but I wasn't having it. "Megan, I told you if you did this, we'd be done. It's over. The wedding's off, and we're finished." Then I slammed the phone down and walked out. At that point, I didn't know where to go, so I headed back to Tom's place. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Megan kept trying to reach me, but I ignored every call. The only person I spoke to was my dad. I explained to him in PG terms what had happened and told him I needed to get out of town for a while. I didn't give him much of a choice, and I still feel guilty about the way I spoke to him. For 2 days, my phone was blowing up with calls from everyone imaginable, but I didn't answer. I felt completely lost, like I was walking around underwater. Tom mentioned I should start thinking about my financials and protecting myself, but I wasn't even in the right mindset to care about that. The house, the wedding, the car loans, it all seemed trivial compared to what had just happened. The next day, I sent Megan an email saying this would be the last time I contacted her. I told her I was leaving the city for a while, that the wedding was off, and everything between us was over. I called my dad again and had a long conversation with him. Even though he was heartbroken, he understood that I needed time and space. He still hoped we could work things out, but I was already checked out. 10 days later, I boarded a flight and headed to Bali. I ignored all of Megan's messages and emails, and I didn't respond to anyone else either. I didn't know if Megan stayed at the hotel that night, and honestly, I didn't care anymore. Once I landed in Bali, I basically drowned myself in alcohol for a month, only staying in touch with my dad and work. I didn't even care if I got fired. I wish I could say I enjoyed my time in Bali, but I spent most of it just drunk and full of anger, shame, and regret about how everything had unfolded. Tom and I stayed in touch about my leave, and after 3 weeks, he asked if I could head to Tokyo to handle some work matters. We also talked about the global virus that was starting to spread, and I mentioned returning to Canada to sort things out before lockdowns began. I flew to Tokyo on March 1st, and it felt good to get back to work, even if only for a little while. As lockdown rumors became reality, Tom suggested I head back to Canada, but I brushed it off, thinking the situation would only last 30 or 60 days. I needed more time to figure out my next steps. Those 30 or 60 days turned into a year. I didn't return home until after I got vaccinated, and by that point, I wasn't in a rush to go back. My house was rented out, and while I stayed in touch with family, I refused to hear anything about Megan. On September 21st, I got a call that my dad had a heart attack. Thankfully, he was doing okay, but he'd need triple bypass surgery. It wasn't as dangerous as it used to be, but I still wanted to be there for him just in case. I knew going home would stir up a lot of drama, but I was prepared for it. I just wanted to see my parents, thank Tom for everything, and face whatever came next. The thought of seeing Megan again filled me with uncertainty. I had no idea how I'd feel or react when that moment came. Now, I'm flying out in 4 hours and will land in about 24. Update to come after I land. The old man leans in, looking at me, and says, "Listen, kid, I know you've had some issues with your girl, so let me give you a piece of advice." He mentions a guy's name I don't quite remember, but the gist of it was this: God gives women eyebrows, and she plucks them out just to draw on new ones. God gives her a face, and she covers it up with makeup. He gives her breasts, and she goes out and buys a push-up water bra. He gives her a body, and yet she's not satisfied, so she wears slimming clothes to alter her shape. If God himself can't satisfy her, how do you think you're going to manage, brother? Don't go killing yourself over this. I was kind of blown away by that, I've got to admit. The old man then turns to Tom and says, I can trust you to handle this properly. Your mother will kill me if I have to fire you. And that's when it hits me, Tom and the old man are actually related. We walk out, and I look at Tom, saying, 20% less pay? Really? He throws an arm around me and says, don't sweat it, I've got your back. I ask him, so, am I getting fired or what? No, idiot. You're getting promoted, he says with a grin. He then gives me a peck on the side of my head and adds, I could have told you earlier, but this way was way funnier. I've missed you, man. Now, let's go get trashed. It's 8:30 in the morning, I reply. Tom shrugs, you've still got a lot to learn about enjoying life. This is typical of him, honestly. What should I expect from a guy who once got drunk before noon and ended up in a fistfight with a monkey at a hot spring in Japan only to get his ass handed to him? We did end up getting drunk, though. We chatted about work and what was coming down the line. We talked about Megan, too. Tom told me I needed to meet her and get closure. He said, we've both made stupid choices, but we're good people. Once you get closure, you'll be able to move forward, unburdened by emotional baggage. He was right. After that, we could figure out my future, where I want to go and what I want to do. So, at least one thing was crossed off the list. I still had my job. My dad was doing well. But Megan? She was still on my mind, constantly. I unblocked her on Facebook and started scrolling through her profile, trying to prepare myself for what was coming. I sent her a message, asking if we could meet for dinner. We exchanged some polite words, and we set up a dinner for the following days. When the day finally came, we agreed to meet at a restaurant a few hours after she finished work. Going into it, I had two main fears, that my anger would still be there, and I'd act accordingly, or that my love for her would still linger, and I'd act on that instead. I was hoping to find some middle ground between those extremes. But as soon as she walked through the door, all my plans flew out the window. She looked amazing. When she smiled and walked over to me, my stomach jumped into my throat. I wasn't even this nervous when we lost our virginity together. We shared a brief, awkward hug, and I could smell my favorite perfume on her. Was she trying to love bomb me? Was she playing some emotional games? Or was she with someone new, here to flaunt it in my face? There were no rings on her fingers, not even the one I gave her. We started off talking about my dad. She told me she always checked in on him during her shifts and assured me his surgeon was top-notch for the upcoming bypass. We stuck to small talk after that, her workload during the pandemic, my time in lockdown in Tokyo. I was barely holding it together. Outwardly, I seemed calm, but inside, I was unraveling. I knew I needed this meeting to help me sort through my feelings so I could finally move on. It felt like we were both dancing around the elephant in the room for far too long. Finally, her expression changed, and we dove into the real conversation. She started, I need to tell you how sorry I am for everything that happened, for hurting you. I asked, are you sorry you got caught or sorry for actually hurting me? Of course, I'm sorry for how it affected you. How it tore apart our lives and our future, she replied. I threw it all away because of my insecurities. So, did you plan it because you were insecure, or were you trying to punish me for the people I'd been with before we were a couple? I asked. Maybe both. But let me make one thing clear, any guy I was with before we got engaged, I never loved them the way I loved you, she said. My ex cheated on me because he said he couldn't compete with my feelings for you. That's why we broke up. I hadn't known that before. Honestly, I never felt bad that her ex cheated. I didn't want her to know I was about to sleep with someone else. I thought I could emotionally detach and that even if you found out, we could work through it like we had with everything else. You thought very wrong. It was probably the most painful thing I've ever been through, I said. I didn't need you to be perfect or experienced. I just needed you to be mine. All of them, Megan, every single one, could never compare to how I felt about you. But now, I'm wondering if it was real or just the fantasy we built for ourselves. Megan excused herself to the bathroom, clearly emotional. As she left, I glanced over at Tom, who had tagged along to support me. He was sitting in the lounge, having an animated conversation with two attractive women, laughing and gesturing. When he saw me, he gave me a thumbs up, smiled, then flipped me the bird with a smirk. Typical Tom. Megan came back, and we resumed the conversation. Do you want to ask anything about that night? She asked. It doesn't matter, I said. Nothing can be undone. I wasn't even sure I could go through with it, she added. When you called, it scared the hell out of me. I ran down to the lobby, but you were already gone. It doesn't matter anymore. I'm not here to relive the past. I'm here to figure out how we move forward. Can you forgive me? She asked. Of course, I forgive you, I said. You're not a bad person, you just made a series of terrible choices. It's not entirely your fault. I should have been more understanding of your worries, too. I went through a roller coaster of emotions, love, anger, regret. One part of me wanted to scream at her, while another wanted to take her home and pretend nothing had happened.